The contrast couldn't be starker. German soldiers had been raised on the belief that willpower conquers everything, that discipline, that fighting spirit, that refusal to surrender could overcome any material disadvantage. Noble sentiments, perhaps, but in the brutal reality of industrial warfare, spirit alone doesn't prevent frostbite from destroying toes. It doesn't stop infections from spreading through feet wrapped in frozen rags. It doesn't give soldiers back the ability to march when their boots have disintegrated around their feet. American planners, sitting in offices far from any battlefield, had arrived at a different conclusion entirely. A soldier's capacity to endure depends directly on the condition of his feet. An army that can guarantee every single soldier reliable footwear is an army that understands how to fight wars that last years rather than months. For those German prisoners sitting in Texas camps, all this context remained invisible at first. They'd arrived with their pride still intact, still believing themselves part of a superior military tradition despite their capture. When they first saw those American shoes, they saw only what their expectations told them to see: clumsiness, lack of sophistication, evidence that their captors were somehow less professional than themselves. But as they began working under that relentless Texas sun, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks stretched toward months, a different kind of education took hold. Not through lectures or formal instruction, but through the simple physical experience of walking mile after mile in footwear that actually supported them. Every step became a silent lesson in the failure of their own supply system. Every evening spent without blisters or bleeding heels drove home the point that their military leadership had prioritized appearance over function, symbolism over practicality. That's the paradox that cuts deepest. An empire that boasted endlessly about its invincibility, its technological superiority, its careful planning, brought low by something as prosaic as a pair of shoes. The leadership back in Berlin had looked at their soldiers and seen symbols to be displayed. The Americans had looked at their soldiers and asked a simple, practical question: what will keep these men able to fight for as long as the war demands? The evening those American shoes first appeared in the camp created an atmosphere you could practically touch. Guards had rolled a crate into the supply building and started distributing pairs to prisoners selected for work assignments outside the fence. The Germans handled these shoes like they were examining evidence of some elaborate joke being played on them, passing them hand to hand, tapping the rubber soles with their knuckles as if testing whether they were real. One corporal, his voice dripping with contempt, announced loud enough for everyone to hear that these were boots for peasants working fields, not soldiers serving in a professional military. The comment drew laughter that rippled through the entire group, men repeating the joke until the barracks echoed with their collective derision. Come morning, though, reality started its slow work of demolition. Out in the work details under sun that beat down without mercy, the prisoners, still wearing their German boots, began limping within hours. Leather already weakened from hard use cracked further, seams split open, blisters swelled up at pressure points where the rigid boots refused to flex with natural movement. Meanwhile, the prisoners who'd been issued American shoes kept working without obvious distress. Those thick soles cushioned every step across uneven ground. The lighter weight meant less strain on calves and thighs already weakened by poor camp rations. The leather, plain and unremarkable as it looked, bent and flexed in all the right places. By the time the sun reached its highest point, you could see the change written on faces. The mockery from the previous night had transformed into something much harder to disguise. Reluctant respect fighting against ingrained prejudice. One particular account survived the war in a diary confiscated by camp security. A mechanic from Hamburg named Karl Heinemann had written about his experience after spending a full day hauling lumber. He noted that his American-issued boots remained nearly intact, while his friend's German pair had left the man's feet bleeding through his socks. The entry reads almost like a confession. "We laughed yesterday," he wrote in careful script, "but today every one of us wants another pair of these shoes." He went on to describe how a guard had distributed water during a break, and mentioned casually that American soldiers regularly march 30 miles in this footwear without collapsing from foot injuries. Carl admitted, with the tone of someone forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth, that he believed the guard completely. The gossip network inside the camp spread this kind of information faster than any official announcement ever could. By nightfall, everyone knew. Some prisoners, the ones still clinging desperately to their sense of superiority, muttered that these shoes were nothing more than peasant tricks, that they couldn't possibly compare to the craftsmanship of traditional German military boots. But even those holdouts found themselves reluctant to take the American shoes off. In the dim light of the barracks after the day's work ended, men sat on their bunks and pressed their feet against the floor, marveling at the absence of pain. The very objects they'd scorned just 24 hours earlier were now saving them from the constant agony that had become normal. Then came the moment that cracked something open that pride couldn't seal back up. During a rest period, one prisoner who'd fought on the Eastern Front sat holding his American shoes in his lap. His voice came out low, but just loud enough for the men nearby to hear clearly. "If we had been issued these at Stalingrad," he said, with the weight of someone who'd watched friends die, "perhaps the winter wouldn't have consumed so many of us." The words landed among the group like a physical blow. Silence followed, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any argument. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody offered a defense of German equipment or strategy, because everyone sitting there knew he'd spoken nothing but truth. It wasn't just an acknowledgement that American shoes worked better. It was an indictment of their entire system, of leaders who'd sent men into killing cold without adequate protection, of a supply chain that had valued appearance over survival, of pride that had marched soldiers to their deaths rather than admit it might learn something from others. That laughter from the day before had curdled into a heavy, oppressive stillness. The kind of quiet that settles over men when they're forced to confront the gap between what they were told and what they've experienced. By the time the lights went out for the night, the barracks remained hushed. The American shoes sat lined up beside dozens of bunks, arranged almost reverently, as if they'd become objects worthy of respect rather than ridicule. The prisoners had stopped mocking. Now they could only stare at what their own leadership had denied them. Basic endurance, simple comfort, the small mercies that separate survival from catastrophe. The paradox deepened as prisoners began their regular work assignments beyond the camp's barbed wire perimeter. Each week brought new groups escorted under armed guard to local farms or construction projects, laboring under contract arrangements that deposited small wages into camp accounts they could theoretically access after the war ended. For these assignments, the American shoes became standard issue, no exceptions, no alternatives. The Germans who'd arrived skeptical now found themselves lacing these shoes on each morning with a care that bordered on ritual. They understood, whether they wanted to admit it or not, that the day's work depended on their feet holding up. One particularly brutal day in July of 1944 stands out in the records. The work detail involved moving heavy timber across ground broken and uneven from recent rains. American guards, every one of them wearing the exact same shoes as their prisoners, joked among themselves about how many pairs they'd gone through during basic training. A sergeant mentioned offhandedly that his current pair had lasted nearly a full year of constant marching without needing replacement. The German prisoners exchanged looks loaded with meaning. For them, such durability existed only in fantasy. In Russia, many of them remembered soldiers had routinely scavenged boots from corpses, so desperate were they for anything that might protect their feet from snow and ice. Letters intercepted by camp censors confirmed this bitter comparison, playing out in prisoners' minds. One soldier, an Obergefreiter named Hans Vogel, had written to his wife back in Dresden, "The shoes here appear plain," he wrote, "but they carry a man far without complaint. I walked through an entire day and felt as though my legs had grown stronger rather than weaker. It humiliates me to admit this, but the Americans understand how to care for their soldiers in ways we never did." The letter never reached Dresden, locked instead in a file marked for examination. Yet it revealed what many prisoners were thinking but couldn't say openly: that something as mundane as footwear could tip the balance between endurance and collapse. Statistics support the point beyond any argument. During 1943 alone, United States factories shipped over 9 million pairs of service shoes to troops overseas. Each pair weighed roughly half a kilogram less than standard German military boots. That difference, multiplied across an army numbering in the millions, translated to immeasurable energy saved on every march. For soldiers already carrying packs, rifles, ammunition, and everything else needed for combat, those grams added up to hours of sustained movement. American planners had done the unglamorous mathematics of endurance. They'd calculated how much difference a lighter boot makes over 10 miles, over 20, over a campaign lasting months, and they'd calculated correctly. Among the prisoners, discussions grew heated as men grappled with implications they couldn't ignore. Officers, still clinging to hierarchical pride, insisted that German engineering and craftsmanship remained superior, that true soldiers endured hardship without needing comfort, that complaints about equipment were beneath the dignity of the Wehrmacht. But enlisted men, the ones actually doing the work, grew less convinced with each passing day. They felt the difference in their bones, their muscles, their feet, that no longer ached constantly. Arguments erupted quietly after dark, some men mocking the regime's obsession with appearances and ceremonies, others defending it as necessary tradition that held civilization together. The shoes had become more than just footwear. They'd transformed into a mirror reflecting two completely different philosophies of warfare, colliding in the dust and heat of Texas captivity. By the time that month ended, the transformation was impossible to deny. German prisoners no longer ridiculed American shoes in any context. Instead, they competed for newer pairs when supply crates arrived, checking soles for thickness and wear, eyeing each other with barely concealed envy when someone received a fresh pair. What had begun as objects of contempt, dismissed as gear, suited only for farmers and laborers, had become coveted possessions, things men wanted, needed, valued. The irony must have been almost unbearable for them. Proud soldiers who'd believed themselves part of an elite military force, now bowing their heads before the simple practicality of American industrial production. Day after day, step after step, the lesson worked itself deeper into their understanding, not through any formal education or propaganda presentation, but through the plain physical reality of feet that didn't hurt, legs that didn't give out, bodies that could endure what had previously seemed impossible. The message came through in the rhythm of marching boots on Texas soil, in the absence of blisters and bleeding, in the startling realization that comfort and effectiveness weren't contradictions but complements. By late 1944, the education provided by those shoes expanded beyond farmland and construction sites. Selected groups of German prisoners, chosen through criteria the men never fully understood, were escorted under heavy guard into American industrial facilities. These tours served dual purposes according to camp administrators. They kept prisoners occupied with something other than idleness and resentment. They also demonstrated, in ways no propaganda film could match, the sheer scale of United States production capacity. For many prisoners, these visits provided their first glimpse of the machinery behind the footwear they'd come to value so highly. In Detroit, a group of prisoners stood inside the Ford River Rouge complex and struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Conveyor belts stretched further than the eye could follow, rattling and clanking in constant motion, churning out not just trucks and engines, but crates upon crates of standardized equipment, boots among them. A factory guide explained in simple terms that every machine operator could stamp, cut, and assemble identical pieces with such precision that thousands of finished pairs emerged each day without variation. One prisoner whispered to another, "This isn't an army at all. This is a factory that happens to carry rifles." His companions said nothing in response, but their silence carried the weight of recognition, of understanding finally clicking into place. The contrast with German production methods couldn't have been sharper. In occupied territories across Europe, shoemakers still worked primarily by hand in small, scattered workshops, often with resources that dwindled by the month. Leather shortages forced constant substitutions. Soldiers received boots with cardboard insoles, wooden heels, uppers stitched from cloth rather than proper leather. Anything to keep bodies mobile. Here in America, millions of identical pairs rolled off assembly lines without pause, uniform in size, uniform in strength, uniform in every detail that mattered. A single pair of shoes made visible the true meaning behind the phrase, "arsenal of democracy." Even more shocking were the casual details prisoners overheard from American workers. A foreman joked with his crew about keeping 2 extra pairs of army shoes in his home closet because the government issued replacements faster than he could wear them out. The German prisoners exchanged glances heavy with meaning. In Russia, soldiers had lost toes, waiting weeks for replacement boots, while supply chains collapsed under the strain of distance and winter. The irony of abundance versus scarcity cut into them like a blade. Among the guards, one story in particular made the rounds until it achieved the status of barracks legend. A German sergeant who'd built his reputation on harsh discipline was observed carefully polishing his American-issued shoes late at night, treating them with the kind of care usually reserved for dress uniforms or ceremonial equipment. When another prisoner asked why he bothered with such attention to footwear he'd once dismissed as peasant gear, the sergeant muttered something about a soldier's duty to honor the things that keep him alive. His words, never intended for official ears, got repeated and embellished until they became folklore within the camp. The ideological foundation cracked wider with each passing week. For many prisoners, the shoes had stopped symbolizing humiliation and started representing revelation. Here was concrete proof that American strength didn't flow solely from superior weapons or numerical advantages. It came from caring about the ordinary soldier's needs. They began understanding that every rivet, every stitch, every carefully engineered sole represented planning that extended far beyond battlefield tactics. Someone had thought about feet, about comfort, about keeping men functional through campaigns that lasted years rather than months. At this point, a question worth considering emerges. What carries more weight in the final analysis? The pride that comes from wearing polished boots that gleam on parade grounds, or the quiet strength found in footwear that keeps men standing upright through snow and sun, through mud and desert, through every miserable condition war can produce? The answer seems obvious now with decades of hindsight. But for men raised in a culture that valued appearance and tradition above practical effectiveness, admitting that answer required breaking something fundamental inside themselves. Inside the camps, the growing respect for American footwear created divisions that hadn't existed before. Officers fought to maintain morale among their men, struggled to keep alive the belief that German superiority remained unquestionable despite all evidence to the contrary. They reminded their subordinates that discipline, rather than comfort, had carried the Wehrmacht across half of Europe in the war's early years. Yet even as they spoke these words, they could see the eyes of their men drifting downward to the very shoes that now carried them through captivity. The disconnect between official rhetoric and lived experience had become too obvious to ignore. The enlisted prisoners, most of them ordinary working men before the war, farmers and factory hands and students conscripted into service, talked late into the night when officers couldn't overhear. They compared the American shoes not just to their old German boots, but to everything they remembered from home. One man recalled how his father had patched the same pair of work boots for years because buying replacements was financially impossible. Another described watching comrades in Russia cutting strips from dead horses to wrap around frozen feet when standard-issue boots fell apart. Against these memories, the American shoes seemed almost miraculous in their simple competence, light enough not to exhaust you, durable enough to last, replaceable when they finally wore out. For the first time, questions emerged about what their government had actually provided in exchange for all that demanded loyalty. An officer's diary, confiscated by camp censors in early 1945, captured this growing unease perfectly. He wrote about overhearing two young soldiers debating whether America's strength came from its industrial machinery or from its apparent concern for ordinary men's welfare. "They talk as if a pair of shoes proves something about democracy," he wrote with obvious contempt. Yet even this officer admitted feeling uncomfortable, knowing that his own boots had left scars on his feet that still bled with regularity. The camp guards noticed subtle changes in their prisoners' behavior. Hardened men who'd survived brutal campaigns began displaying small acts of care toward their American-issued shoes, lingering a moment longer when lacing them up in the morning, walking with posture that seemed straighter, almost proud when wearing them. Some prisoners even asked quietly whether they might be permitted to take their shoes home after the war ended. Such requests were uniformly denied according to regulations, but the fact that these questions were asked at all revealed a psychological transformation taking place. Men who'd arrived in Texas, convinced of their superiority, were leaving with doubts they'd never imagined possible. The cracks in ideology widened into something more permanent as time passed. For years, these soldiers had absorbed messages about German ingenuity, standing unmatched anywhere in the world. About American society being crude, materialistic, obsessed with money rather than honor, weak at its core despite superficial power. Yet now they felt the opposite truth pressing against them with each step they took. The regime they'd served had demanded endless sacrifice, but given little in return beyond propaganda and empty promises. America, even in details as small as footwear design, seemed to give more than it demanded. This raises another question worth your consideration. What really defines a nation's strength? Is it the grand symbols that dominate newsreels and propaganda posters, the tanks rolling past reviewing stands, the aircraft flying in perfect formation? Or does strength reveal itself in unseen acts of care for soldiers' daily endurance, in decisions made by bureaucrats and engineers who never get mentioned in history books? The debates happening in those Texas barracks 8 decades ago still echo today because they touch something fundamental about how we organize society and allocate resources. By the time 1945 arrived and the war stumbled toward its conclusion, the silence among German prisoners spoke far more eloquently than their earlier pride ever had. The shoes they'd once ridiculed had become teachers more effective than any formal instruction. Every step taken in American footwear served as a reminder that the smallest comforts can demolish the grandest illusions. When the war officially ended that spring, when repatriation finally began, many prisoners asked with something approaching shame whether they might be allowed to keep a pair and take it home. For most, the answer came back negative. Regulations forbid it, supplies were accounted for, everything had to be returned to proper inventory. Yet even without the physical shoes, the memory remained, something that had worked its way beneath the surface of pride and couldn't be extracted. Years later, memoirs published and interviews conducted revealed how persistent that memory proved. A former member of the Africa Corps, interviewed in 1963, admitted that what humbled him most profoundly wasn't American armor or air superiority. It was the shoes, he said plainly. They looked ridiculous to us when we first saw them, but they carried men farther than we ever managed. That's why they won the war. Another former prisoner recalled long marches across Texas farmland in summer heat, how the shoes seemed to absorb the impact of hard ground, leaving him less exhausted than he'd felt during any campaign before his capture. The symbolism grew sharper with the distance of hindsight. Germany had poured resources into spectacle, into uniforms that looked impressive, medals that caught the light, parades that stirred emotions. America had invested in logistics, in the unglamorous work of ensuring soldiers had what they needed to function day after day. The shoes stood as proof of an industrial empire that produced weapons, certainly, but also thought carefully about soldiers as human beings with physical limits that needed accommodation. To many former prisoners, this realization planted seeds of change that would grow for the rest of their lives. They returned to Germany not just defeated militarily, but transformed in understanding. They carried awareness that true strength doesn't announce itself with trumpets and drums. It shows itself in preparation, in caring about details that seem too small to matter until suddenly they're all that matters. Even camp gossip from those years carried echoes of this transformation. Guards remembered how prisoners who'd once quarreled over equipment assignments now competed for the privilege of receiving newer shoe pairs, a far cry from the derision and mockery that had greeted those first crates. They remembered, too, the particular silence that followed whenever someone whispered the thought that haunted them all. If we'd had these in Stalingrad. That silence hung in the air, heavier than artillery fire. It was the silence of men realizing they'd been failed by their own leadership. The silence of history delivering its verdict, not through speeches or treaties, but through the soles of footwear. So the story reaches its end, not with battles or dramatic confrontations, but with a simple image that contains everything important. Picture that dusty barracks floor somewhere in Texas during 1944. Dozens of pairs of American military shoes lined up neatly beneath wooden bunks. German prisoners who'd laughed at those shoes now treating them with something approaching reverence. No propaganda could have delivered a message more powerful. No lecture could have cut deeper into their certainties. The lesson had been walked into their very bones, absorbed through thousands of steps across Texas soil, learned through the absence of pain they'd come to accept as normal. This story lingers decades after those Texas camps closed down and their fences rusted away to nothing. It persists because it was never really about leather or rubber or manufacturing techniques. It was about the collision between pride and reality, about men discovering that strength gets built not just from courage or dedication, but from care. The German prisoners who mocked those shoes were really mocking an entire philosophy, the idea that small, unglamorous details deserve serious attention. History proved that those details matter most of all. Consider again that silence following the whispered words about Stalingrad. That silence is still with us, resonating across the decades. It reminds us that wars don't get decided exclusively by tanks crushing across fields or bombers darkening skies. They get decided by endurance, by whether feet can carry bodies 1 mile further, 1 hour longer, one day beyond the point where exhaustion demands surrender. Victory lives in that endurance. Defeat lives in neglect. For America, the shoe represented more than equipment. It embodied a philosophy, a conviction that ordinary soldiers deserved thought, deserved planning, deserved the quiet respect of a government willing to spend time and resources on comfort as well as firepower. For prisoners who eventually understood this, the realization tasted bitter, perhaps even humiliating. Yet it also planted something unexpected in their minds. Respect. Not just for the shoes themselves, but for the nation capable of producing them. For a system that valued soldiers enough to care about their feet. The image endures with strange power. Rows of German prisoners silent in Texas twilight, their laughter long gone, heads bowed slightly as they tightened laces on footwear they'd scorned just days or weeks before. A paradox transformed into education, mockery converted to reverence. History conceals its sharpest truths in the smallest details. And here, in something as ordinary and overlooked as a pair of military shoes, we find a story that speaks across time about what matters when everything else falls away.